Hi everyone, I'm James, and in today's video we're going to be servicing the transmission of my Spitfire. I'm starting with removing the rear extension of this transmission. First step is to remove the nut from the end of the output shaft. As you can see, I'm holding the flange with a pair of slip jaws and using my rattle gun to get the nut off. If you don't have a rattle gun, you can just as easily use a vise and a socket set. That'll do the same job. I use that method to torque up the nut with my torque wrench. The next step is to take the bolts out that connect the extension to the gearbox. These proved a little difficult for me because I don't have the transmission mounted properly in any sort of vise, but got there in the end. Very interesting how these bolts will thread through into the interior of the casing. I'll show you that in more detail later in the video. One thing I've started to do off camera is actually remove the speedo gear from the side of the extension. I got so far and wasn't sure what was meant to come off first, so I proceeded with the extension. I did actually end up though pulling the speedo gear out before I pulled off the extension, again off camera. I don't think this is entirely critical, but probably better safe than sorry. The next step is to tap the rear extension so you get it off the output shaft. Yeah, this didn't entirely work, and by didn't entirely I mean didn't work at all. So after a heck of a lot of hammering, some you'll see here and plenty more off camera, I realized that the problem was that the output shaft bearing at the end of the extension was stuck on the output shaft, and I had to come up with a better method of getting the extension off. Okay, so off camera, because quite frankly it was frustrating me and I didn't know how well it was going to go at all, I managed to get the extension off the back of the gearbox. No damage was done, despite a lot of hammering and all sorts of fun and games. What I had to do in the end was I used my mitre bench and suspended the transmission over some blocks of wood so it wouldn't fall too far. Clamped the mitre bench onto the neck of the extension, and then I used a block of lead to prevent damage, sat that on the end of the output shaft and whacked it with a hammer. So now I'm going to proceed with cleaning up the extension. I've actually already pulled the old sealing ring out of the end of it. I just used a pinch bar to pry that out and hammered in a nice new one. See there in black. And the next thing to do is to clean up the surface, get the old gasket off, and clean up the mating surface over here. This is in reasonably good condition. It's just a few chunks of gasket to pull off. Something worth noting, of the 7 bolts that hold the extension on, the bolt holes, 4 of them, this one, this one, this one, and this one around the back here, are all through holes into the main gearbox, so they will need some sort of thread sealant or copper washer on the bolt. Right, now with the extension all done, time to move on to the rest of the gearbox. I've already taken off the gear lever extension. Need to do that to get that extension off. So that's waiting some attention. I should also note that I put the extension back on with a nice new gasket. I'll cover my gasket technique a bit later on. Now I'm proceeding to remove the gear lever top plate from the gearbox. I gave everything a good clean before I took it off to stop any dirt getting into the gearbox. Okay, so here we have the inner workings. Our two levers there. If I look in there, there's where the gear lever slots in to actuate everything. Look in here. We can see the lever for reverse. And the teeth for everything else other than where it engages with the reverse gear here. It's fairly well worn. Everything else looks okay. So I checked everything out and gave it a good clean out inside, got all the old oil out and was reasonably happy with it, so now it's time to reassemble everything. There's a lot of debate around on how you should actually seal components, what you should do with the gasket, how you should repair it, and that sort of thing. After a lot of research, I wasn't really able to come up with any conclusive answer, so I ended up going with a method that I thought was quite reasonable and worked with components that are a bit older, probably a bit scratched, and it's also a method that will allow me to easily separate the components again in the future should they prove not to be effectively sealed. So what I'm doing is taking the paper gaskets that I got from Rimmer Brothers in the UK and applying a thin bead of gasket sealer to one side of the gasket, usually the side that I want to stick in place, and then on the other side of the gasket I put a thin layer of grease, so this should help seal the other surface. Then it's just a case of locating the part correctly, making sure it's nicely seated, and getting a torque wrench out and torquing those bolts down properly. Something this job reminded me about was the fact that components like this don't need to be torqued very heavily. The torque spec on these is relatively low, and when you're using a quite large torque wrench, they can feel like you haven't really done them up very tight at all. However, as long as you follow the spec in the manual, you should be absolutely fine. My next job was to sort out the gear lever extension. The main joint on the bottom of the gear lever was very loose. You can get a kit for all of this, but I didn't have it, so I'd been and got some nice thin poly washers to go in between the mounting points. It took quite a lot of messing around to get them sitting in exactly the right position. There's a spacer that goes in the middle that the bolt goes through, and then there's nylon washers that go around the outside, and basically I was trying to pack those nylon washers to give it some more space, or less space as it were. So after a bit of messing around, I managed to get them sitting outside the spacer but alongside the nylon basically packing washers, and that sorted everything out. Then it was just a case of cleaning everything up, greasing up the joints properly with nice fresh new grease, and putting the extension back on the gearbox with its new gasket and torquing the bolts down to spec. So that just leaves the last piece of the transmission to sort out, in terms of the gaskets anyway, which is the bell housing. So this is just a case of undoing 5 bolts from the interior of the bell housing. You, according to the instructions, are meant to take the clutch fork out, but you don't need to. The other thing to note here, the bottom of the 5 bolts is again through into the gearbox, and that has a copper washer on it. Then it's just a case of cleaning off the old gasket material, tidying up the surfaces, and applying a new gasket. In this case, the gasket was very old, but it obviously had been replaced at some point, but I don't think every time the thing had been separated, because it came apart far too easily.
there was one corner where there were 2 layers of gasket material, so obviously someone just hadn't done a very good job ages ago putting it back together. So I cleaned that all up, and hopefully that'll lead to everything sealing a lot better this time. So with that all done, that's the transmission ready to go back in the car, which will likely be the next video. So if you've enjoyed this video, feel free to hit that like button. Go ahead and hit the subscribe if you want to see what happens next time. Remember, it's free on YouTube. And I'll see you around. Hit me up in the comments if you've got any questions. Thanks everybody. See you next time.